Good evening, everyone. My name is Tricia Ritterbusch. I am the Director of Communications for the College of Arts and Sciences, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's special event. The College of Arts and Sciences Arts Unplugged series brings research and creative works into the public sphere for discussion and inspiration. And what could be more timely than a look at the global impacts of Russia's invasion of Ukraine? Our moderator tonight is Ray Jayawardhana, the Harold Tanner Dean of Arts and Sciences and Hans Bethe Professor. Dean Ray's curiosity about the geopolitical landscape of our world, as well as worlds beyond our own, is a great example of what is best about the College of Arts and Sciences, serving as a nexus of discovery and impact. In addition to his role as Dean, Ray is deeply involved as an astronomer on the new James Webb Space Telescope. This NASA mission is an awe-inspiring feat of global cooperation, all for the sake of curiosity and humanity's quest for a deeper understanding of our universe. On his watch, Ray has elevated public engagement as a strategic priority for our college, and I am forever grateful for that because I and my fantastic team get to work on events like this one. With that, please join me in welcoming our moderator for this evening, Dean Ray Jayawardhana.
I'm live. Great. Thank you very much, Tricia, and good evening, everybody. Great to see so many of you joining us this evening for a very timely discussion. I do want to begin by thanking Tricia Ritterbusch, Linda Glaser, Kathy Hovis, Laura Kikasan, rest of the communications team in the College of Arts and Sciences for playing an integral, central role in elevating our public engagement mission, really bringing the voices of our faculty, their expertise into the wider world, and also bringing experts, particularly journalists, to our campus to engage with us here with our students, with our faculty, with our broader community. I'm delighted to be part of this, and I want to, without further ado, introduce our all-star panel tonight. Starting with our current Zubro Distinguished Visiting Journalist, Anne Simmons. Anne is the Moscow Bureau Chief for the Wall Street Journal. And as you would appreciate, it's quite a privilege for us to have her here on campus, especially at this particular time. Thank you. Please. Anne is a veteran when it comes to covering the former Soviet Union and now Russia. She reported for Time magazine from Moscow back in the 1990s, writing about the aborted coup against then Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev and the ascension of Russia's President Boris Yeltsin. Her reporting has taken her around the world, from California to South Africa. Among the many important stories she's covered, peace initiatives in the Middle East, led by the then Secretary of State Warren Christopher, and US troop deployments in Haiti and the Balkans. She served as the bureau chief in Nairobi and Johannesburg for Los Angeles Times, and in 2004, she was part of a LA Times team that won a Pulitzer Prize for breaking news coverage of wildfires in Southern California. Welcome, Anne.
Thank you. Thank you.
Next, joining us on the podium, we have Peter Katzenstein, the Walter S. Carpenter Jr. Professor of International Studies in the Department of Government in the College of Arts and Sciences. His research and teaching lie at the intersection of international relations and comparative politics. His current research interests focus on power, the politics of regions and civilizations, America's role in the world, and German and European politics. And among Peter's many, many international honors and awards is the Johann Skytte Prize, considered the most prestigious international award in political science. He's authored and co-authored and co-edited many, many books, including Uncertainty and Its Discontents, Worldviews in World Politics. And very recently, he's co-edited a volume called The Downfall of the American Order, ? That's important. Welcome, Peter. Next, we have joining us Jessica Chen Weiss, the Michael J. Zak Professor for China and Asia Pacific Studies, also in the Department of Government in the College of Arts and Sciences. She studies Chinese politics and foreign relations with an emphasis on nationalism and public opinion, focusing on the connection between domestic politics and international relations. She's the author of Powerful Patriots, Powerful Patriots, Nationalist Protest in China's Foreign Relations. While on sabbatical last year, she's supported by a fellowship from the Council of Foreign Relations. Jessica served as senior advisor to the policy planning staff at the US Department of State. So she brings in expertise and experience from within and outside the academy. Welcome, Jessica. And last but certainly not the least, we have Mark Landler, the London bureau chief for the New York Times, who's on a flying visit, 3 nights in the US and heading right back, or 2 nights. In fact, we're delighted he could join us to bring his perspective from across the Atlantic. In 3 decades at the Times, he has served as bureau chief in Hong Kong and Frankfurt, White House correspondent, diplomatic correspondent, and European economic correspondent. He began his career as a business reporter in New York. Mark won an Overseas Press Club Award in 2007 for his work on a series about China and the environment. He's the author of Alter Egos, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, and the Twilight Struggle over American Power. Welcome, Mark. So we'll start this evening's conversation with very brief remarks from each of our panelists. Anne, why don't you begin?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Can you all hear me? Great, thank you. I've got a few notes here. Don't worry, I'm not going to take forever. Just as a reminder. We're here to discuss mainly kind of how the world has changed because of Russia's intervention or invasion of Ukraine. So on the 24th of February, Russia decided that it would launch, or Mr. Putin decided that he would launch what he calls a special military operation in Ukraine. The rest of the world calls it war. And his aim, he said, was to denazify and get rid of the Nazi government in Ukraine without providing any kind of evidence, of course, that the Ukrainian government was indeed being run by Nazis. Most of the West agrees that this was an unjustified aggression against a sovereign nation. In Russia, they very much believe, I would say the government there very much believes, and to a certain extent, the supporters of the government believe that Russia is threatened and that Russia was almost under attack by NATO, and the fact that Ukraine could possibly become a member of NATO was not going to sit well with Russia. So today we're fighting a war on many fronts. We're fighting a military war at the cost of thousands of lives of Russian and Ukrainian soldiers and civilians. We're fighting an energy war as Russia uses oil and gas as a weapon of war. We're fighting an information or misinformation war as we see the level of propaganda that is being distributed in Russia and elsewhere to do with this war. As we know that there was a failed shock and awe initiative in the very beginning by Russia to take Kiev. They did not manage that. But now we are 7 months into a war that no one had anticipated. And this war has changed the world. It has changed the geopolitical landscape, the security architecture of Europe, the economic architecture of Europe. It's prompted unprecedented sanctions against Russia. We've seen a kind of unity among the European countries in the European Union. And of course, in Russia, they very much feel that Russia is under attack by the West. Now, I'm not going to go on because I've just got 5 minutes, but I do want to add that, right now what we're seeing is Russia has decided to call what it's describing as being a partial mobilization. But from what we've seen today, this actually isn't a partial mobilization. Many people are being called up, many men of a certain age. And there are discrepancies in what Mr. Putin has said and his defense minister and what the decree actually says. So to wrap up, I think that, these are some of the questions that we are going to discuss. The war has triggered several questions, and I'm hoping that we'll get to discuss some of them this evening. Will NATO be drawn into a fight? Will the West want to go to war to save Ukraine? Are sanctions having an impact? What is it? Does it ever help to serial sanction Russia? Have they learned a lesson from this? Will Russia become dependent on China? And to what degree? And will China actually be willing to step up and help? And has Mr. Putin miscalculated? Why has he gone to these lengths to launch this special military operation when he knows that, it could lead to his demise, possibly? And very lastly, how does all of this come to an end? So I'll leave it as that.
Thank you, Anne. You've taken a lot of my questions away, but that's great. We can all think about it as we listen to Peter next.
Yeah, thank you. Those were tough questions, Anne, but we'll get to them. So I want to quote a president, Cornell President Martha Pollack, who in her welcoming address this August said, "This is a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world." And I wish that President Putin had listened. He didn't. And he thought it would be a cakewalk in Kyiv and that the government would just give up. And a Wall Street Journal article on that very first battle we talked about is probably the most important article on the war. It was due to the local initiative of one commander who managed to get trucks on the runway to stop the paratroopers from landing in large numbers in that airfield. That changed the war. So Clausewitz writes about the fog of war. This war is very foggy, and we don't know what's going to happen. What is the kind of war? I don't think it's a global war. It's a regional war in Europe with global implications for security, if there's a use of nuclear weapons, certainly for food security, and for the environment right now. So Russia has done this before, that is, attacked a neighbor and not win. This was in 1939, and the neighbor was Finland. That didn't work out too well for Russia. And now this war has drawn Finland and Sweden to want to join NATO. That will be a strategic defeat of the first order for Russia. Russia is suffering brain drain. Up to 300,000 young Russians who will find gainful employment without any trouble in Europe or in the United States have left. But Putin represents something which many Russians share, which is a Eurasian worldview. In his view of the world, Eurasia is the largest landmass, and Russia is a world power. And it is entitled to its own sphere of influence, just as the United States is to its America's sphere of influence. So that, I think, is driving the war from the Russian perspective. Now, the Ukraine, I think, is like Russia. It's a kleptocracy. Except we have just rechristened it as a liberal democracy, starting in February 24th. It's a magical transformation of a country in our public assessment, I think driven by the heroism of the Ukrainian population. Zelensky was a joker. Not quite. Zelensky was the candidate of the East to make peace. It was an electoral revolution which propelled him to office in 2019. I think he won with 73% of the vote. That has never happened before. He didn't deliver. I'm not a Ukrainian specialist, but I asked myself, why didn't he deliver with that mandate? The Ukrainians wanted peace. And my assumption is that there are strong oppositional forces in the Ukraine saying, do not make a deal with Russia. But I leave that for better informed people on the panel to address. But it was certainly true that Ukrainian nationalism has been activated by this war as by no other event. The EU, I think, is a major culprit of this war. In November 2013, the EU insisted that Ukraine would have to choose between East and West. That was a great, great mistake. Ukraine shouldn't have chosen. Ukraine should have said, we want to become part of the EU and we want to become part of the Eurasian Economic Union, which is a Russia-led EU on the east. But the European Union is in foreign policy affairs so inept that it didn't see this. The solution would have been an Austrian solution, Austrian neutrality. The end of the war, in some form or another, will be a neutral Ukraine, but probably not an Austrian solution, but a Swedish solution. And finally, the United States. The United States is also a major culprit. As late as last November, did the United States issue policy or supported the policy aspiration of the Ukraine to join NATO. This has been a non-starter since 2008 when the Bush administration articulated it. The French and the Germans said, that's not going to happen. So each of these countries, not just Russia, has contributed mightily to the war which is now being fought with potentially global implications. So I'm all with President Polak. I'm not with President Putin. But when it comes to the future, I'm still with Yogi Berra. It is tough to make predictions, especially for the future.
Thank you, Peter. You brought up a lot to the table for discussion. Over to you, Jessica.
I'd like to widen the aperture a little bit and talk about the broader global and geopolitical implications of the war in Ukraine. I'm thinking about the international system and the future of the international order. The war in Ukraine has really, I think, brought geopolitical competition to the fore and rising tensions not only between the United States and Russia, but also between the United States and China, I think raise questions about how much longer the center can hold in the so-called rules-based international order. Sitting in Washington for the last year or so, and only recently coming back to Cornell, I was really struck by how both China as well as the United States saw Ukraine through the prism, really, of this broader geopolitical competition. China certainly, in Beijing, seeing Russia and Putin as a crucial strategic partner in an effort to resist what was seen as, and is still seen, as an effort to contain China. For the U.S. part, I think, of course, even as there have been enormous efforts underway to support Ukraine, there was also a desire to use the moment to strengthen transatlantic unity, not just against Russia, but also to bridge the gap there in how we and our transatlantic allies view the China challenge. So even as both Washington and Beijing proclaim that there is no Cold War, we do not seek one, I think it's a fact that both Beijing and Washington are engaged in a global struggle. And so even as we feel the aftershocks of Ukraine, which I think will continue in uncertain directions, we are also simultaneously, I think, on a dangerous trajectory toward another, even perhaps more seismic earthquake with China. On the present trajectory, which emphasizes democracies versus autocracies, and where the United States and its allies particularly its democratic allies, are going around the world trying to rally a coalition to stand not only against Russia but against China. I think that the end state here, where you speak of the end game, we don't know where this is going, and I think that the action-reaction spiral around Taiwan, and we'll get, I think, in a bit to, are there really parallels here? I think that they are overdrawn, but nonetheless, there is a separate action-reaction spiral underway that has been, I think, accelerated by this narrative of democracy standing against authoritarian aggression, and that Taiwan is a thriving democracy, and we must do all we can to support Taiwan. Of course, that's not how Beijing sees it, and our efforts to support Taiwan, I think, are also pulling forward some of the things that Beijing might do in response, and have seen a little taste of that this summer with Speaker Pelosi's visit. So I would say that on the current course, I think we are heading into an increasingly fraught geopolitical environment, one that is going to continue to crowd out, I think, the necessary attention and resources to tackling shared challenges, and it will continue to put strains on an international order that's already been, I think, quite eroded. Now, I would say that yesterday, President Biden took an important step rhetorically toward an inclusive future that includes more than just democracies. As he said at the UN General Assembly, the United Nations Charter was negotiated among citizens of dozens of nations with vastly different histories and ideologies, united in their commitment to work for peace. So as I recently wrote in an essay for Foreign Affairs, competition cannot become an end unto itself. And so long as outcompeting authoritarian competitors, China and Russia, defines America's sense of purpose, we will continue to measure success on terms other than our own. And that if the pursuit of peace is the ultimate objective, then we don't need to defeat China or eliminate Putin in order to win.
Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you.
Mark, thanks.
Thank you very much, Ray, and thanks for the invitation to Cornell. Peter and Jessica just did a very good job of sort of setting the stage for the geopolitics. I come at this story as a journalist, and in the last two jobs I've had, I come at it in very different ways. I was a White House correspondent for most of the Obama presidency and half of Donald Trump's presidency. And I've been the London bureau chief for the last 3 years. When I covered foreign policy during the Obama administration, one of the great themes that President Obama wrestled with and tried to make the case to a sometimes skeptical public was about how the U.S. needed to recognize and accept a sort of new, less global, less policeman of the world kind of role. And it manifested itself in a lot of rather anguished foreign policy debates over the end of the Iraq War, the perpetuation of the war in Afghanistan, our geopolitical competition with China, and then lastly, what to do about Russia. And as early, of course, as 28 and then later 2016, 2017, it was pretty clear that Putin was on this revanchist course in Georgia and in the Donbass in Ukraine. And, you know, Obama at the time had a very skeptical view about whether there was that great an American imperative in this part of the world. And I remember very vividly, he had a dinner for foreign policy experts and historians at the White House in September of 2014. And the dinner was a 2-hour-long dinner, and it was divided into two parts. The first hour was about sort of ISIS and extremist threats in the Middle East. And the second hour was about Russia and Ukraine. And Obama opened the second hour by asking the table, would someone please tell me what is the American stake in Ukraine? And there were a lot of very well-known Soviet-era experts at the table. Strobe Talbot was there. And several of them looked around at each other sort of slack-jawed, because the whole idea that an American president would be sort of questioning a central tenet of American post-war foreign policy was to them kind of shocking. But that's exactly what Obama was trying to do. He was trying to say, maybe there are places in the world where we simply don't have a strategic imperative anymore. And I think in 2014, he put Ukraine in that category. I don't think he understood why he would risk an escalatory situation over a country that, as Peter said, was hopelessly corrupt, by a president that he had other business with around the world, including the Iran nuclear program. And so, he took a fairly hands-off role, as did the Europeans, and we saw what happened. And in those days, there was a very vigorous internal debate in the White House over whether to ship Javelin anti-tank missiles to the Ukrainians, which Obama opposed until the very end of his presidency, when he grudgingly changed his mind. But the person in the administration who did make the case for Javelin missiles and for taking a stronger line in Ukraine was Vice President Joe Biden and his foreign policy advisor, Anthony Blinken, who's now the Secretary of State. So to some extent, you can see the roots of what's happened over the last 6 or 8 months back in the debate that unfolded in the White House in 2014. And so one thing I just wouldn't mind talking about later is a little bit of how America's position in reaction to Putin is a function of a debate over America's role in the world, and also a reaction to some things that have already gone wrong during the Biden presidency, notably the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan. And so that's my first angle on the story. My second angle is, as a resident of London and living in Europe, I do think that the crucial test for the West is coming in the next few months, and it's going to manifest itself in a variety of potentially dramatic ways across Europe, not just in Germany, but Germany's perhaps the most conspicuous example, where they face the real prospect of skyrocketing prices for gas, natural gas rationing, potentially having to shut down large parts of their industry because they simply don't have enough natural gas to fuel them. And even in places that are more shielded from Russia, like the UK, just a week ago, lost amid the pageantry of Queen Elizabeth's death, the new prime minister in the UK announced a massive state intervention in the energy market to essentially cap electricity and gas rates at well below what their market rate would be, at a cost in the first year of £100 billion and potentially rising up to 150 or 200 billion pounds. The kind of expenditure that's going to blow out not just the budget of the UK government, but the same story will replay itself across continental Europe with all sorts of interesting economic consequences and potentially political consequences. We're already seeing in Italy the rise of another potential populist right-wing candidate. So I think of it both from the point of view of what it says about this long-term debate we've had about America's role in the world in the US, and then also how the Europeans are going to hang through this winter, and what it says about their willingness and ability to step up to both their own economic but also their security responsibilities. And we've seen some dramatic moves so far. The question is, what is the European staying power going to be, and particularly what is it going to be if we have a winter where people start having to wear, as Peter said earlier to me, long johns in their apartments. So those are the issues I wouldn't mind wrestling with.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you all. You've raised some incredible questions and issues and given us a sense of the stakes here on so many fronts of what really is a regional conflict, as Peter put it, but one very much with dramatic global ramifications. With so much ground to cover, so many aspects to consider, and with such an incredible panel, I'm struggling to figure out where to begin. But I'll begin with the big picture, the focus of tonight's conversation. How is this international or world order that Jessica referred to being rejigged as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine? How are the alliances, the rivalries, economic and political relations between nations being altered? With that, I'll turn to you, Anne, first. Is Russia being compelled to look east for allies as Europe and the United States have come together to oppose its actions? What's the view from Moscow?
Actually, yes, it's a good question. I think Russia has been compelled to look east. Russia and China have always had an alliance, a kind of frenemy, as we call it, relationship, friends on one hand, enemies on the other. But right now, Putin needs support. And if Europe has abandoned Russia, the view from Moscow is then our friends are in another direction, in the east. Now, it's interesting because Jessica, you may be able to expand on this a bit further, but President Xi of China, he has, really trodden a very fine line. On the one hand, China has said that, yes, we understand Russia's grievances. But on the other, there hasn't been a full-hearted kind of show of support for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I think the president actually even went to the extent of saying that, he was concerned last week. He told President Putin this, that he was concerned about the war. India comes into this also. President Modi of India, Prime Minister Modi of India, said that this is not the era for war. But what happens is, this week, Putin escalates the situation by calling what he's called a partial mobilization. So one wonders, is he even listening to these world leaders? India is also really, India is in a position where it realizes that it gets most of its military supplies from Russia and wants to continue to do that. It is facing pressure from the West, and in particular from the US, to try and break off those ties. But I think in the end, we're going to see this troika, this threesome of India, China, and Russia coming together to form this new alliance, because Putin has always said that the world order does need to be reshaped in terms of who is in charge, or whose interests are at stake. And for the Russians right now, it's Russia. And they're trying to pull in other countries that they feel also might have grievances against the West, and in particular against the US.
It's just a quick follow-up. So you don't have a sense yet that the conversations with President Xi and Prime Minister Modi altered the calculation in Moscow?
I don't think they did alter the calculation. I think if they had altered the calculation, President Putin would not have come out on the day that President Biden and President Zelensky were scheduled to speak at the United Nations General Assembly and make this big announcement about escalating the war and possibly threatening to use nuclear weapons, a tactical nuclear strike. Now, we've had a lot of conversation, Professor, about this as to whether or not he actually intends to do that. I am actually of the mind that it is his trump card, that it is a real possibility that being backed into a corner, that could be the next move. And I say that also because President Putin does have a lot of support among Russians. He also listens to the far-right conservative wing, and they have been baying for blood. They have actually been saying, after Russia was forced to retreat, which they call regrouping, after they were forced to retreat from parts of Ukraine they had managed to capture, there were, among the Kremlin pundits and pro-government officials and also just pro-government Russians, there were people calling for Putin to launch a strike, nuke them, was some of the comments there. So I think it's a really scary proposition, and it could be just posturing, and it could be just the fact that Mr. Putin knows that if you use, the nuke word, the N word, that basically the West will be trembling in its boots. But again, it could just be posturing.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to Jessica next to chime in here with your perspective. So ostensibly, China has been neutral in this conflict, and yet, as Anne alluded to, there are indications of sort of a realignment, perhaps also to some extent, including India. Is China drawing closer to Russia as a result of this recent history? And can you elaborate on that?
I think you have it right by putting neutral in air quotes there.
Yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't call China neutral, but neither is China all in with Russia, I think, on this in this conflict. I think that Beijing has tried to stake out what some have called a strategic straddle, where on the one hand, Beijing has provided diplomatic cover and looked for ways to support Russia in ways that haven't risked secondary sanctions. But at the same time, Beijing has complied with those sanctions and largely limited its military assistance to Russia's war in Ukraine. So I think ultimately what Beijing is trying to do is deepen its strategic and military relationship with Russia while also tempering the blowback to China's international reputation, as well as its material interest in continuing to have access to international finance, capital, and technology. And so this is obviously an awkward position, and I think it has made at various points made China look pretty hypocritical in supporting Russia on the one hand, but also claiming to defend sovereignty and the sanctity of the UN Charter on the other. But I do think that China will likely continue to seek closer strategic ties while maintaining its tactical distance from the war in Ukraine, so long as Beijing sees Moscow as a crucial strategic partner in what it sees as resisting the United States and the US-led order.
So what lessons are being learned by China from the international reaction to Putin's actions? And let's go there. What are the implications for Taiwan?
Big question, and as I hinted earlier, I think that it's still a little early to be drawing. I mean, Beijing is still drawing lessons, and after each war that it has observed others conduct, it's taken a year or two for them to fully draw and study the lessons of those wars. But I still think that there are some early lessons we can point to. I think first, I think Beijing was surprised by the speed and the willingness of the United States, Europe, and a few Asian allies to impose swift and sweeping economic costs on Russia. I mean, frankly, I think we surprised ourselves. And as a result, I think Beijing has accelerated its efforts to achieve self-reliance, to head off the possibility or protect itself in the event of similarly crippling economic sanctions on China. So they held in the spring an emergency meeting on how to protect Chinese assets overseas. But there are also probably other lessons that Beijing is drawing from Russia's sort of military woes on the battlefield, that it's going to have to move faster, more lethally, and be willing to escalate in order to avoid the kind of morass that Russia seems to have fallen into if it were to act against Taiwan. And one other thing, I think, which I mentioned earlier, which is that the conflict in Europe has also, I think, increased international support for Taiwan. And it's strengthened this narrative that democracies have to stand together against authoritarian aggression, not just interference, but literally armed aggression. And I think this has further aggravated the suspicion in Beijing that the United States and its allies are really, as Beijing calls it, seeking to use Taiwan to contain China, and are committed to, even though the Biden administration and others will say, we do not support Taiwan independence. Nonetheless, I think there is a growing suspicion that is in the works, and it's not helped by former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo saying that we should today offer Taiwan our diplomatic recognition. And so these moves toward permanent separation, if not outright independence, would really cross Beijing's red lines and probably lead to the use of force, even if Beijing isn't fully militarily equipped, according to a recent survey of experts and former U.S. officials.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to Mark to explore another aspect of sort of the rejigging of the world order, for the lack of a better term. So some might say the United Kingdom has played an outsized, certainly a highly visible role in providing arms and other support to Ukraine, and in rallying Western nations behind sanctions, for example. Especially post-Brexit, do you think this has been an opportunity for the UK to reassert its relevance and perhaps leadership in Europe?
Well, yes, but with certain limitations. It is true that the United Kingdom has done a lot. They've trained 20,000 troops. They were the first to send in lethal defensive weapons ahead of the U.S. And as you say, in the sanctions debate, Boris Johnson, of all people, was one of the leaders that pushed very hard for the SWIFT regulations to be imposed, and by all accounts played an important role in the G7 in getting that done. So the answer is yes, and the reasons for it are rooted in their own post-war history. I mean, if you go back and look at the immediate post-war period, as far back as Churchill, there was always a strong anti-Soviet, firm anti-communist kind of sort of focus in successive British governments. And all of that was deepened a lot in the last few years by the Salisbury episode, where, if you remember, the Russians used nerve agents on one of their own, or nerve gas on one of their own agents in Salisbury, England, which was sort of a galvanizing event for the British security state about what the Russians were willing to do on foreign soil. They expelled about 60 or 80 Russian diplomats. So this kind of tough anti-Russian posture is a long-standing thing in the UK. So it wasn't a surprise to see them take that role. But I think your point about Brexit is a valid one. I think that in a post-Brexit world, the Brits are really eager, if not even a little desperate, to show they're still relevant. And the one area where Britain is still relevant is in the military and security realm. They do have the strongest military in NATO aside from the U.S. They've historically spent more on their defense than France and Germany, although that may now change with some of the recent commitments the continental Europeans have made. And so this was a very comfortable issue. It played to an existing strength. All that said, and for all the other things you could make fun of Boris Johnson for, or criticize him for, he was early in backing Zelensky. He was early in going to Kyiv. He's incredibly popular in Ukraine. It may be the only place where he's incredibly popular. And I think for some valid reasons. Why I say there's limitations to it is that really what Britain derived its true influence from in the last few decades was playing this role, but doing it at the top table in the European Union. And they no longer sit at that table. So they can play this very strong role almost as a wingman to the United States, which is sort of effectively what they've been over the last several months. And they can be powerful in fora like the G7. But if you're not sitting at the table in Brussels with Macron and Olaf Scholz, you're losing something. And there is a discussion underway. Macron is pushing this to have a kind of an informal European security arrangement. And there's talk that the French and the Germans may invite Liz Truss, the new prime minister, to take part in that. And she's said by the British press to be skeptical of what this is. I'm sure that on the right in Britain, this will be cast as a backdoor way to bring Britain back into the European Union. I would think it would be smart for her to go to that meeting, if invited, and be part of that conversation, because Britain has a great deal to offer. I mean, remember in the run-up to Putin's invasion, when the U.S. was disclosing intelligence in a sort of a very choreographed and careful way to make the case, the Brits were the people doing it with the U.S. Because Britain still has a very strong intelligence capability. So I do think that it has given them a chance to be relevant, but again, with the limitation that having taken themselves out of the European Union, they don't sit at that top table, and as long as they don't, then inherently they'll lose some of the influence that they could have had.
Thank you. So Peter, I'm going to come back to a comment you made in your introduction about a possible strategic mistake on the part of President Putin he's basically given a shot in the arm to NATO, even though supposedly he felt threatened by NATO's expansion, but the result has been potential expansion of NATO. And you've written a lot about the looming downfall of American power or American order in the world. But in some sense, hasn't American influence actually grown as a result of this conflict? Like, how would you characterize American leadership and power on the world stage?
So I want to say something to my students who are sitting here in some numbers. Yeah. You're seeing offensive, defensive, and classical realism in action on this panel, okay? But it's only realism. There's no other perspective. And you know the limitations. So has America leadership been reaffirmed? I think President Biden lives in another era. This is not the leader of the free world any longer. There is no free world. We are post the Cold War. I think that's what Jessica is trying to stress in her article. And the fact that China and India, that is the looming world powers, peer powers of the United States, saying, this is not our concern. If it's your concern, be our guest. So is NATO has been revived for sure, but it's held hostage by American domestic politics. I mean, why are we so sure that there will be President Biden in Washington in 2025? Why not imagine another president, maybe not elected democratically, following a totally different foreign policy script? That's NATO stability hangs on that much more than anything else. So I think when America's leadership in the world was secure, it was in part because it was secure domestically. We are domestically confronting a humongous crisis. And we all know it. It's just 3 states which have to flip. That is 3 states where, in fact, the election will be rigged. That's not out of the question. And if that election is rigged, we will be so preoccupied with ourselves that we can't pay attention to the world. And so I think for the realists to equate Beijing, Washington, and Moscow with individuals, it's a highly reductive way of thinking about world politics. Each of these capitals has its own political game. And we know ours pretty well. I don't understand the Ukrainian one. Although my hunch is, and I talked to Anne about this, is that Zelensky didn't make peace because he couldn't. Because the right wing in Ukraine is too strong. And they told him, if you make peace, we'll take you out. I haven't seen this in the press. Anne says they're researching it, but the sources aren't good enough to publish it. Okay. So, but I will
Anne in trouble.
I will just say that these domestic politics are enormously important for the Ukraine, for Russia. Putin is doing what he's doing, not necessarily because he wants to. He's being pushed by his right. And, of course, by the defeat on the battlefield. Yeah. But we are being pushed, too. And therefore, this notion that America's and NATO's stock has risen, I said, yes, right now, but it may be very temporary.
Thank you. You read my mind. I was going to ask about the intersection between the domestic and the international, because what's happening among nations affects and is affected by what happens within nations, right? So as Peter already went there, don't you have a sense, though, Peter, to stay with you for another moment, that as of now, there seems to be a fair degree of bipartisan consensus in terms of America supporting Ukraine. And by the way, the price tag is pretty hefty. It's not an insignificant amount of money being spent in support of Ukraine. So either despite that or because of it, somehow there hasn't really been domestic pushback against that very open support.
Our notion of price tag has been changed in the last 3 years.
Good point.
I think COVID and now what the energy packages will be in Europe will run in the hundreds of billions and trillions of dollars. So mobilizing $60 billion for Ukraine may be just small change right now, psychologically. But I think the war is being supported in public opinion, and there's a grassroots level, by about 2/3 of the American population, which is, given the polarization of the society, remarkably high. But I also think that the public takes its cues from its leaders. And the leader of the exile government has not taken a position. And because he has lots of other problems to think about, right? But we know that he said NATO is a defunct operation. I will leave it. That wasn't so long ago. That was 2016, 2017. Why wouldn't he possibly say that again in 2024? If that were to happen, there will be new European security order, but there will be much less support for the Ukraine. Right?
A little dark. Mark, I'm going to turn to you about the UK involvement. How's the involvement in Ukraine playing to the domestic audience there? And in some ways, you already alluded to this. Has it been an opportunity for the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson and now the new Prime Minister Liz Truss to stand strong on the world stage, to bolster their image at home, in some sense?
Well, I mean, look, like in the U.S., there's broad support for Ukraine in the U.K., probably even somewhat higher. But I think there's actually a distinction to be drawn between the U.S. and Europe in this regard, which is that, as Peter said, $60 billion in the current environment can seem a bit like small change. The U.S. hasn't committed any troops to this effort, and there is a giant ocean between the U.S. and Europe. And no one's going to have a cold house this winter in Ithaca, New York, because Putin turned off the taps. That's not true in Germany. And while it's probably not the case in the UK, it is true that the government is going to have to destroy its public finances to prevent that from happening in the UK and all across Europe. So I think that for the moment, one can say that there is a lot of support for the war. And by the way, not just in the UK, in Germany and France. But I think it's much more tenuous in those countries because I think that the consequences of skyrocketing energy costs, public finances coming under unprecedented strain, and the possibilities of rationing and industries being shut down are just extremely volatile and unpredictable in a way that they're not in the United States. You know, for all the talk about the economic problems in this country and runaway inflation, the inflation rate in the UK is solidly over 10%, and according to some of the private market estimates, it could go as high as 16, 18, or even 20%. It probably won't, owing to the massive intervention in the energy market, but I think people here maybe don't understand just how dire the situation could be in Europe in 6 months. And so while it's true to say there's support now, the big question is there going to be support in March? And I just think we don't know the answer to that in Europe.
Thank you. So Jessica, you've written extensively about the how Chinese foreign policy is shaped by domestic considerations to a large extent. How is that playing out in this case? Do we have any sense of kind of the public opinion on the ground sense of the Ukraine conflict among the Chinese public?
So let me preface it by saying it's hard to know, but there are signs, even inside China's pretty opaque authoritarian regime, that there is both, even at the highest levels or within Beijing, debate over how close to stand with Russia. And even some analysts whose voices and pieces were quickly censored have warned against the costs to China of this full-fledged alignment with Putin, including China's increased diplomatic isolation and the strengthening of transatlantic solidarity, and really the jeopardy that China faces in terms of its own continued trajectory upward. I mean, Liz Truss threatened that basically the G7 could essentially derail China's rise. And so I don't know whether how much of that is just bluster, but that's the kind of headwinds that China could be facing. But I would say that these voices that are expressing concerns about this strategic alignment between China and Russia are really in the minority. And they continue to lose the debate, I think, really because the advocates of closer cooperation with Russia really are able to say, look, what would we even get by distancing ourselves from Russia? There's only, the United States or others would only take advantage of that split, and there would be no strategic benefit, only strategic risk to doing so. So I think that that's why we are seeing this increased, I think, strategic cooperation. Of course, recognizing that Beijing and the various entities inside China, economic entities, have been under pretty strict, I think, both instruction, but also then have chosen in their own economic interest not to bust these sanctions for fear of what it would mean for their bottom line. So I think, ultimately that's why I think that the trajectory of U.S.-China relations and that competition will, in the end, I think, filter back into which of these voices inside of the Chinese system will end up winning out, as those who prioritize access to international capital and technology, which drive Chinese growth and modernization. They are, I think, still, in some ways, I think, playing second fiddle to those who are prioritizing the strategic and geopolitical imperative of having, Russia at China's back.
Thanks. So I want to for the last part of this segment, I want to turn to Anne to hear a bit about how the conflict is playing within Russia itself, not only in Moscow, but also in the hinterlands. And I'm particularly curious if you sense any kind of shift in the public support or mood over the past 7 months, perhaps most recently with the most recent announcements of partial military mobilization. Do you expect a bigger shift?
It's a really interesting question because what I don't think is understood in much of the West is that despite the repression and oppression that Russians face on a daily basis, there is actually strong support for Vladimir Putin and this special military operation. Both state and independent, in quotations, and polls show that he has still the backing of the people. And if you go out into the hinterlands, into Middle Russia, and which I have done, and if you speak to ordinary people, they'll tell you first and foremost that we have a leader that is trying to protect our sovereignty. We have a leader that is trying to ensure that the West doesn't cancel Russia. We have a leader that cares about its people. And you can ask these people that you speak to, well, are you aware that Russia is indiscriminately bombing certain areas of Ukraine, that Russia is being accused of committing these awful atrocities, these war crimes? And they'll spin it and they'll say, well, actually, no, it's the West and it's Ukraine that is committing these atrocities. One of the reasons for that is that the propaganda machine in Russia is a really well-oiled machine. If you turn on state television or if you read state newspapers, you get a very different view to what I'm here now in the States. If I turn on CNN or, Al Jazeera or the BBC World Service, I get a very different picture to what I get if I turn on, which I do every morning, state TV in Russia. There is this narrative that Russia is under threat, that NATO, and in particular the United States, is trying to erase Russia from the map. And if you're constantly hearing that and bombarded by that, it's they package it really well. I can understand how people would believe this. And also, it's not just about believing what we would call misinformation. It is also about the fact that Russians are very, very proud. And I always say that whether or not Russians, your average Russian, believes in the politics or the policies of the Russian government, of the Kremlin, they believe in being Russian. And any attack against Russia and Russianism and the Russian people, they become very defensive. So, many of my own friends will say, we don't particularly believe in Putin's politics or policies, but we do think that the West is trying to subjugate the Russian Federation. I think there has been, it's interesting because if you go out on the streets of Moscow and St. Petersburg today, it's life as normal, right? And I'm saying, say a week ago, right, when I was still there. Life as normal. Everything's available. You can buy Indian food 24 hours a day. You can go shopping. Everything is available. And the war had not really hit home. You can tune out of state TV and just don't watch it. And then, your life continues. But I think with this week's mobilization, although it's been called a partial mobilization, it's come home to Russians now that, hold on a minute, I think one young man who one of our correspondents spoke to for a story today said it suddenly jumped out of the television, right? And it's now on our doorstep because anyone can be called up now. And this is going to change the mood of your average Russian. There have been lines of people trying to get out of Russia, mainly young men. There have been one-way tickets on sale for $11,000 on Emirates to go to Dubai from Moscow that would normally cost like $600. There have been people think, that people don't want to fight, whether or not they believe in the special military operation, as the Kremlin calls it. The key is, I don't want to put my, the expression, I don't want to put my life on the line. What was this war about again? And so people have started to question, even in the last 2 days. We've seen some really brave people come out and protest Yesterday, for example, when the announcement came down that they would indeed have this partial mobilization, people took to the streets, I believe it was across 38 cities in Russia. And you may think, well, you know, you can go out and protest, big deal. It is a big deal in Russia because there are very strict rules about protesting. You can't just walk out onto the street and decide, I don't agree with, you know, X policy or Y policy or you know, Z said this. You can't just go out and do that. You have to have special permission to go out and protest. You're no longer allowed to do that. There are laws in place that do not allow that type of protest. They actually say today that it's still because of COVID, because you're not allowed to gather, because, you know, you could spread COVID. So they're using that excuse. But I would say that overall, at this particular juncture, Vladimir Putin still has a level of support that, you know, is going to still keep his government running and the Kremlin and him in charge. There probably will be an erosion of that if people learn of the numbers of dead that are coming back home or not coming back home. Your loved one doesn't return home. I've said earlier that in March, the Ministry of Defense in Russia said that 1,351 Russians had been killed in the war. They've since come out, in fact, Shoigu, I think yesterday, came out and said that actually it's up to 5,996 or something like that. The Pentagon puts the number at 80,000 dead and wounded Russian soldiers. British intelligence is a little lower, between 30 and 50,000, but think about that. Those numbers are catastrophic. It's just, you know, these are deaths of young people. This is Russia's lifeblood, its future. And so one wonders, will the tide change? You know, if they get news of, you know, in fact, I should add that you're not allowed to actually report deaths of Russians. They had a rule that said that you cannot, they were trying to prevent people from posting on social media that their loved ones had died, posting obituaries, because they don't want that out there. And you could risk not getting compensation for your loved ones, like, I don't think, 40 million or 40,000 rubles or whatever, if you speak up. So people are intimidated in that regard. But people have still been doing that. So I think it's going to take a while before you see any kind of shift. Vladimir Putin needs some kind of tangible victory. He does have to have something to show the Russian people that this is why we not went to war, this is why we launched this special military operation. He has to have something to show for that. And I'll just wrap up by saying that, you know, how does this end? I actually do feel that Ukraine is going to have to cede some of its territory, because Russia is not just going to lay down arms. They're not going to just walk away from this war. If they come to the negotiating table, it's going to be because Russia will want to have some kind of, you know, gain from launching this operation. It's going to be difficult because, of course, Ukraine doesn't want to give up its land, you know. It doesn't want to just cede the territory that has already been taken, so.
Thank you.